So today I want to dig a little deeper into the thinking behind the new urban agenda. And we're going to start with some of the people who directly participated in shaping it and then writing about it. And that was the reading assignment that you had today, which was the Quito Papers, a selection from the Quito Papers, which is a longer book project. And I just gave you a link to an abstract or a selection of some of the introductory material from that book. You can follow up with the book if you want to. There's some very interesting material in it as well. But the four authors of that book include the Secretary General of Habitat 3, Juan Clos, who was the one of the co-authors and I think one of the people that was most influential in shaping the new urban agenda and arguing for this idea of a new paradigm. And so I want to unpack that a little bit today, and then I want to explore in more detail the ideas of this so-called new paradigm and what the thinking is behind it, which, as I've said already, taps into a lot of other things going on in the sciences and in related fields that are really only now beginning to really shape the agenda of urbanism, the agenda of cities, the new urban agenda, as we're talking about specifically here. So the language in the new urban agenda actually refers to a paradigm shift here in paragraph 15, readdressing the way we plan, finance, develop, govern, and manage cities and human settlements. So they're already putting that on the table in the language of the new urban agenda. And then, as you were reading in the selection today, in the Quito Papers, Juan Clos, that should be CLOS, by the way, not CLOSE. I'll fix that. And his colleagues, Saskia Sassen, Richard Sennett, and Ricky Burdett, argued that it is a change from the sort of polarized view of bottom up versus top down, that is something beyond just bottom up versus top down, that it's really some kind of an interaction between the bottom up and the top down, and a more open, malleable, and incremental urbanism, as they put it. There's that misspelling again. I'll go back and correct that anyway. And that many of the 94 recommendations determined the generic forms and physical organization of the 21st century of the 1933 Charter of Athens. Remember, we talked about that yesterday and on Wednesday, the continuing influence of the Charter of Athens as a very successful model in many ways, very successful in creating an industrialized environment, creating a lot of economic activity and prosperity and resource generation, resource extraction and consumption, and generating a lot of wealth, and also generating a lot of externalities. And that, as they put it in this paper, that is really where we are still today. We're still in some ways mired in the 1933 Charter of Athens, mired in the crater of modernity and modernization, as Rem Koolhaas put it, and that we need to reframe the discourse and practice of planning, again, to mark a paradigm shift away from this rigidity, as we talked about yesterday, the technocratic model, the model of specialists who are creating a static city as a singular creation rather than an evolutionary co-creation of many actors. Again, they argue for a more open, malleable, incremental urbanism that recognizes the role of space and place. And that's another major theme that we're going to explore, this idea that the city is made up of a particular structure of spaces, of human spaces and human activities that we must recognize in terms of how they function for human beings, and as human beings move about through them and interact with those spaces. And that's what we need to do to make cities more equitable and more successful more broadly. And again, they refer, Richard Sennett here refers in his own paper, The Open City, to what's going on in the sciences, the fact that the sciences are recognizing these evolutionary systems, these self-organizing systems, and that cities are an example of that. And we need to understand that if we're going to make progress on our problems. And Senate also says that we need to recognize with Jane Jacobs that places need to become more diverse, more compact and more interactive, dense streets, packed squares, creating the unexpected encounter, the chance discovery, the innovation, which is the genius loci of cities. And again, hold that thought, because we'll explore that next week when we go into Jacob's work and her understanding of the kind of problem a city is, as she put it. So this is Saskia Sassen on the left and Richard Sinnott on the right. They were participating in something called the Future of Places conference series, which was a precursor to Habitat 3. And it was a one of the, what they call the Urban Thinkers Campus, where many people came together to discuss what needed to be in the new urban agenda, the language in the new urban agenda, especially around public space and around this idea of co-creation of the city. Just to give you a little bit of background about those two, they're very interesting people, very influential sociologists, both of them, husband and wife team. As I mentioned, Saskia Sassen has written a lot about globalization and its processes going on around the globe, and the influence of capital in particular in shaping the global urbanization patterns. You can see that, for example, in what's happening with housing becoming a commodity that can be now financially manipulated in syndicates that can operate globally. You can have syndicates that own real estate in like in my own hometown of Portland, Oregon, and that are interested in raising the rates because they're interested in the maximum return on their investment. They're not interested in what's going on locally in the politics, except as it might affect their return. Richard Sinnott has also written very eloquently and very influentially about the fall of public man, his best known book, and about the way that individualism as a sort of phenomenon really in Western civilization, but especially in the United States, has been at odds with the creation of a public realm and a commons, an urban commons, that this has been eroding as the result of the rise of an individualistic system, a system built on the idea of individualism and individual value, as opposed to value that can be generated collectively and synergistically, with many people working together to create something that they achieve. For example, we talked about the other kinds of capital, not only financial capital, but social capital and other forms of goodwill, for example, for a business or for an individual part of a community. Ricky Burdett is also director of the LSE, London School of Economic Cities department, also a sociologist, and participated with the other three in this developing the language for the new urban agenda and the Quito Papers document as well, and has done a lot of work also on urbanization patterns and the tendencies and the challenges, of course. And then Juan Clos, who I mentioned before, who was the Secretary General of Habitat 3, head of UN Habitat during the period of Habitat 3 and the new urban agenda, and in many ways was the chair of the process of developing the language and getting the document finalized and agreed upon, and then adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries of the United Nations. And in this article in The Guardian, I can send you the link to this if you'd like to read the full article, but I'll just give you a couple of selective quotes about what he's emphasizing, that public space is really fundamental to a city. At another point, he says that without public space, maybe you don't have a city at all. That the idea that public space needs to have a dominant role in the city and connecting up all the other parts of the city. And somewhere between 30 and 35% of the neighborhood should be public spaces. That includes streets, by the way, but streets that are accessible to pedestrians, not just highways or roads or whatever. And then he talks about the fact that we're really far short of this range. In fact, in many African cities, it's closer to 10% or so. And he says it's not always the fact that there's not planning. Sometimes it's bad planning. He talks about Brasilia and Canberra and other cities that are, they look great from the air when you're looking down at them in the sort of airplane view. But when you get down onto the ground, the quality of the public space is simply lacking. And that's, again, this model of urbanization that we've adopted. And he points out that this is not about, refusing to recognize the role of capital or trying to resist the role of capital in some sort of anti-capitalist way, because what we need to recognize is that it is a reality. It is the major force for urbanization in many ways, and we need to embrace that. We need to not be ignorant and pretend that that's not what's important, that there is an economic reality that drives urbanization, and the sooner we recognize that and face it and deal with it as a force, the sooner we'll be able to actually address our challenges. And we need to understand that urban design is not just a matter of strategic planning, master planning, zoning, landscaping, et cetera. It's the relationship in a city between public space and buildable space, which I think is quite eloquent to point that out and to say that this is the art and the science of building cities. And this is the basic knowledge of building cities. And if we don't understand it, if we don't recognize it, we're going to continue to make huge mistakes. I think he's absolutely right about that. And I think that describes very eloquently where we are. And I think it describes very eloquently what the new urban agenda seeks to address in a very sort of wordy, bureaucratic way, which is the way of these kinds of documents where you have to have a lot of people agreeing and everybody gets their argument about which words you're going to use and all the rest of it. And you see a lot of sort of repetitive language and other things, but you can see if you read carefully what is really in the new urban agenda. And it is very much along the lines of this new vision of what kind of urban growth we need. Right now, we tend to think of growth, urban growth, as a certain kind of thing that is going to be bad no matter what it is. And you can forgive NIMBYs, not in my backyard, for often being right about whatever it is that's going to be built is probably going to degrade the livability of their environment. It's hard to argue with that proposition because it is often true, given the ways that we are growing. But this is not what growth always is. This is growth too. For example, the growth of a meadow, the growth of a flower, the growth of an embryo. This is another kind of growth that is, adapting to its environment, that is becoming in many ways healthier and more robust, more resilient to disruptions and change and damage. It's very beautiful. We find certainly that when we see that kind of growth in natural systems and so on. And this is growth too, the kind of growth that we've seen in cities prior to, say, the 20th century, where you had also a very sort of incremental adaptive kind of growth where the parts were adjusting to one another. A lot of different agents were co-creating these structures and evolving them and refining them over time. And they were getting more and more impressive, more and more robust in many ways, more and more beautiful in many ways. And this is stepwise growth in the biological sense that follows follows rules and processes, genetic algorithms, chemical control systems, stepwise transformations over time, compounding forms, and differentiation of those forms, and so on. And we've learned a lot about that in the last 50 or 75 years, how these biological processes actually work, how these chemical control signals and self-organizing processes actually occur. And this is stepwise growth according to rules and processes too. They're just different rules and processes, right? They're segregated use zoning, they're remote design processes where somebody is abstracted away from the actual adaptive needs of the people on the ground. There are a lot of rules like bank lending rules, traffic engineering standards, there are market dynamics, there are incentives and disincentives and so on. But that's a generative system too, no less than the other kinds of systems that we talked about. And we need to understand it on that level. And I'm going to come back to that point at the end of the talk today to discuss a little bit about what that means, about how we need to change our methodologies, change the tools that we use. But we also need to change our thinking. And I go back to this quote from our friend Mike Batty, talking about the city as a contact system, as a set of interactions and flows that define the kinds of networks that allow people to create opportunities, allow people to prosper and to become healthier, to find health care and well-being, and to find environments where they can exercise and be well, all the things that cities give us at their best. And at the same time, that cities also create enormous efficiencies and remarkable creativity with few resources, reductions of resource consumption rates, which is quite a remarkable accomplishment. I mentioned the chart the other day of the greenhouse gas emissions per capita in cities versus more sprawling urban structures. And it's quite remarkable that cities in a remarkable way allow us to produce wealth, well-being, social wealth, social capital, and also physical wealth, economic wealth, with remarkable efficiencies, increasing efficiencies over time, in fact, reducing resource consumption. So this is a very hopeful thing about cities. It's been said that in cities are the challenges of the future, but also in cities are the hope of the future, is the hope of the future. And I think that's probably true. Certainly the dynamics of these processes in cities and towns of different scales. So we're in a moment in history right now where we're seeing a dramatic change in our understanding of the structure of nature. You've all heard, I'm sure, some of the concepts that have emerged over the last decades, the idea of fractals, the importance of networks and network dynamics, network structures. What's happening in neuroscience is really fascinating. What's happening with generative processes, so-called cellular automata, where you have very simple rules that generate very complex patterns, very complex results. You've heard, I'm sure, about bird flocks and the fact that the birds are following very simple rules, but they're generating very complex patterns of the bird flocks as a result of that. And those are algorithms. Algorithms are simply when you follow a rule and you recycle that process and keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, and you generate over time changes to that process, which is the way that, for example, fractals are generated and other structures in nature through algorithms. You have all heard about algorithms in computers, and sometimes they can be quite negative if you're talking about, the Facebook algorithm or the AI algorithms that track you and can figure out who you are and what you're spending money on and so on. Those are algorithms too, but it's all part of the same set of insights. And the idea that we're creating structures that are evolving over time through adaptation. This is what we understand about evolution now, that the growth of form results from the adaptations over time through these sort of iterative processes, these algorithms that occur in morphogenesis. And there is a connection to our own understanding of these phenomena, our own desire to be in beautiful natural environments, for example, known as biophilia. And I'm going to come back to that point. So these are sort of some of the headline topics that we'll explore in a little more detail. And we'll also explore some of the different fields of the sciences and how those have applied to city understanding. I mentioned network science already and how important that is to urban economics, to ecology, understanding how ecological networks and behave and why some are more resilient than others and so on, and how there's this enormous capacity for creativity and human development in cities, precisely because they are spatial networks that allow us to connect with one another and at the same time protect ourselves to some degree, gives us choice, gives us agency. And this network of public space also promotes an extremely resource efficient way of life. It's part of the network connectivity, the metabolic efficiency of that network system that allows that great efficiency. And we're beginning to understand that. The idea, again, of evolutionary morphology, that environments evolve and change over time. They're not just static creations at one point of time. They are shaped by generative rules. There are lessons in, for example, the way that natural environments are shaped and the way they achieve a dynamic complexity that we can apply to cities, and we can apply to our own experience of cities, our cognitive and environmental experiences in, for example, biophilia I referred to just a minute ago, and the idea that we can promote our own well-being and the health of our activities and our interactions as a result of the kinds of environments that we're in, the kinds of connective properties that they have, not only properties of movement, but properties of vision, the things that we can see, the structures that we can see and experience, the fractal qualities of them, and so on. And this is a very important insight as well. We're learning a lot from anthropology and sociology and related fields, that how people interact within public spaces, how they use public spaces, what is so important about the edges of public spaces, which we often get wrong as urban designers when we're thinking about how to create good quality public spaces, and we often fail at that task. So we need that knowledge. We need to be able to put that into practice. We need to understand genetic processes and how they create certain kinds of form that in some cases is all about recapitulation of form and stability of form over time, along with, yes, some novelty and some dynamism. And I think a powerful case could be made that we are far too emphasizing today novelty and dynamism, and not recognizing enough the role of recapitulation and stability in sustainable environments of various kinds, sustainable ecosystems, sustainable structures, and the idea that there are structural attractors that can recapitulate over time. For example, the dorsal fin of a porpoise is a recapitulation of the dorsal fin of the shark, not because the porpoise wanted to have the style of the shark or be retro, or, it has nothing to do with fashion. It has to do with problem solving and with the evolutionary response to dynamic problems, problems of turbulence and laminar flow and complex interactions with the hydrodynamics of water and so on. And it just so happens that form is a successful adaptation to that problem. And that is what's known as a structural attractor, the form that is a universal solution to a recurrent problem, a structural attractor or a pattern. We'll talk about that when we talk about Christopher Alexander's work. And you can see something similar going on in architecture. I think this is a very interesting field where we begin to look across cultures and see certain universal patterns. For example, the vaulted roof that sheds rain, right? That's a very simple pattern, but very effective in its job of shedding rain. And you see that pattern over and over in many cultures. Another area is in game theory. All of us within the urban environment are and within the planetary economy ultimately are in a kind of massive multiplayer game. We're following rules. We are interacting with one another. And according to those rules, we are making choices that are defined or predefined in some cases by the rules. And those choices are generating patterns of activity, patterns of commerce, patterns of interaction that become quite complex over time and generate complex urban patterns, generate complex urban forms over time as well. And this is a very powerful idea that I think we're beginning to understand and beginning to apply in very powerful ways to the understanding of city form and of even of building form, for example. We're recognizing, I think, in this, especially the last 50 years or so, the incredible dynamics of genetic processes. The genome, of course, we have now mapped the genome, and now we're beginning to understand how the proteome works, which is even more complex. The ways that protein structures unfold and interact and transform and take the form of different structures within the body. Amazing stuff and important in understanding how these processes occur and how they self-organize, how they can form healthy processes or unhealthy processes as well. And even going to the structure of the brain, you talk about the genome and the proteome, and now brain scientists talk about the connectome, which is the pattern of interconnections in the brain, which is even more complex, one of the most complex structures that we know of in the universe. The number of potential connections between the neurons of the brain is vast indeed. And maybe cities themselves are like that, because after all, cities are creations of human beings, creations of the human brain, and creations of human interactions and human patterns of connection in a very similar kind of way. And maybe there are analogs there that are useful to us. And I've found this to be a very interesting avenue for exploration, to think about cities as the kind of urban connectome that allows us to be interconnected with one another and with our resources, or maybe doesn't allow us to be interconnected. And that's an important problem when that occurs. And genetic processes that, again, let me just share. I was just checking to see if anybody else would join us. Genetic processes clearly can create astonishing variety. The incredible variety of life forms on the earth today that have been created just by these 4 molecules of the genome. Quite incredible, the sheer variety of forms that have been possible to be created through this process. And of course, astonishing beauty as well. We find it very beautiful because we can perceive the order of these structures, the complexity of these structures, and the ways that they engage us as creatures ourselves, and we can experience that order, and what we experience is that beauty. I already mentioned cellular automata, the idea that very simple rules can generate complex patterns. And indeed, that's what happens in many cases with genetic processes, where the different cells are interacting and sending each other chemical control signals that are relatively simple in the ways that they generate these processes, but the patterns that then self-organize can become quite complex. And you can see, for example, the very complex patterns of seashells or of animal coats or of many other structures in nature that follow this kind of pattern of generativity from very simple algorithms, simple rules. That we can begin to understand. We can understand how this happens even in cities when we're generating urban form, and some of the characteristics of that urban form that come from, again, the algorithms and the rules that we use to generate those patterns, and the very beautiful structures, as I alluded to before, and as you've all experienced when we go into natural environments and we see these very beautiful fractal patterns and patterns of self-organization and so on, not even in the biological level, but at the natural level, the pattern self-organization of bands of sand in the ocean, or stains of water in rocks and so on. And this goes on all across the universe at many different scales. The so-called fractal patterns that we find so beautiful and so moving in many ways, of trees and limb patterns, twig patterns, leaf patterns, and so on. And it happens in the body, it happens in many structures throughout the universe, and it happens in cities and in buildings. And that's something that we're beginning to understand, and we're beginning to harness in a self-conscious way. We harnessed it in an unself-conscious way prior to the modern age of technology and mathematics. And that's been shown through looking at some of the traditional patterns that are indeed fractal in their nature, as we can begin to see when we analyze those. This study by Ron Iglash looked at African fractals and others. There's a lot of work on this that's really fascinating and I think important. And this topic of symmetry, fractals are a form of symmetry. In other words, the different fractal elements at large scale, medium scale, small scale have a symmetrical relationship to one another. They're self-similar at different scales. They have a symmetry of form. And this is something that is now an extremely important topic certainly in mathematics and in physics and in many other fields. This idea of symmetry as a deeper phenomenon going on in the universe and in all of the realms that we experience in our bodies and in our cities and in the structures that we deal with in information. Symmetry is a very important topic in information theory, because information is really just a form of symmetry between one piece of the universe and the other, the one where we're creating the information, that it is informed in the pattern of the thing that we're trying to create information about. And so this is a very important topic in the sciences. And symmetry is often, especially in architecture, I think, thought of in a very naive way, just thought of as the left is the same as the right. You think about symmetrical buildings and you just think, oh, how boring. The left looks just like the right. It's a classical building or something like that. That's not by any means the only form of symmetry. You have rotational symmetry. You have translational symmetry, where you have, again, things that look the same that are repeated over and over again, tiling and so on. And then you have scaling symmetry, like the fractal patterns that we were just talking about. And these all go on all the time, all over in the universe. And in many cases, they are compounded. If you think about the beauty of for example, a kaleidoscope, that has rotational symmetry and translational symmetry and scaling symmetry if there are bits that look like other bits, as they do here, and so on. Fractal patterns, as I mentioned before. And in nature, you have many different kinds of symmetries. You have the left and the right, you have the scaling symmetry, you have the translational symmetry, different trees that look like other trees, and so on. All of these things combine together. And then I mentioned tiling symmetries, which are a very important subject in mathematics, and also a very important artistic domain in many cultures throughout history. In Islamic architecture and design, for example, tiling is very complex and very beautiful, I would say. And in many other traditional cultures, carpet weaving and so on, you'll see many different forms of symmetry, not only right and left, but rotational and translational and compound symmetries of various kinds, in natural structures as well, of course. And in traditional architectures, we have a very naive idea, I think, about modernity being more sophisticated, because now we have computers and now we have more mathematics and more scientific knowledge and so on. But in fact, a lot of our scientific knowledge is revealing to us the very complex sophistication of a lot of older structures, the fractal characteristics, the characteristics of interconnected complex adaptive systems that evolve over time and transform and adapt and become very robust and very successful from a human point of view. So there's a lot that we can learn from these structures, not just sort of copying their look per se, but understanding the generative processes that created them and that could be put to work again to create similarly beautiful and robust structures, again, that have these fractal properties. You can see that in traditional designs like the Islamic settlement on the right. This is in Bahrain. The one on the left is actually MC Escher, a design or a recapitulation of one of Escher's designs. Islamic tiling, again, I mentioned before. But at the heart of all of this is the idea of connectivity, how structures are related to one another, how they're connected to one another in different kinds of patterns. And of course, one of the most fundamental distinctions I already alluded to before is the idea of a neatly segregated structure, a tree-like structure or a hierarchical structure, as contrasted to a web network, or what Christopher Alexander referred to as a semi-lattice. And we'll talk about that in more detail next week. But you can see how interconnected and how more like the web structure so many traditional environments are, so many of the complex adaptive environments of cities like Rome. This is Noli's famous plan of Rome from the 1700s, where you can see how incredibly complex, or the 17th century, sorry, you can see how complex the city was at that time. This was before some of the more modern roads were sliced through. But again, lots of fractal patterns, lots of interconnected patterns, and very complex patterns that resulted, but very organized as well. This isn't a disorderly structure. This is actually a very sophisticated structure with a lot of complex order to it at many different scales, large scale, medium scale, small scale, and tiny scale, down to the level of detail and ornament. And this idea of a network of spaces where you have, for example, the perimeter of a courtyard that has little cellular spaces between the columns, and then those relate to a larger cellular space in the middle of that, that again has a fractal structure to it. It isn't just this sort of hierarchical relationship that we often create when we're creating, the sort of the McMansion, for example. You have the big dumb entrance, you come walking in and you walk down the hallway, and then you turn into the room, one of the rooms, and then boom, you have the view out of that one room, and that's it. It's sort of a one-trick pony, and you have no interaction between the spaces that is complex or subtle in any way, as opposed to this kind of structure, which is more of an interconnected web network, where you have the rooms that you can see other rooms from a given room. You can see across beyond the other rooms, and you can see out to other spaces even within the building itself, and also beyond the building itself. A far more complex structure, even though it's still very simple. It only has a couple of elements, but they're related to each other in a very different way. You can see, compared to this structure has a much more interrelated pattern of connectivity to it. And here's an example of a courtyard house that has some of those characteristics, where you can see the courtyard from many of the interior spaces. You can also connect between the interior spaces. You can also see beyond the courtyard to the view beyond, and you have this much more interconnected, complex pattern as a result of that structure. So we're beginning to appreciate, I think, how these interconnected network structures work as spaces, and how many of the environments that we once thought of as obsolete and of another day and not very sophisticated, and they were just doing this sort of classical thing they had to because the church told them to do it and whatever. Actually, there's a lot more going on there that transcends the particular political and social structures of the time, that is quite universal, in fact, when it comes to fractal structure and network structure and generativity and all of these things that we're talking about, that is going on across cultures, not just within one particular economic social milieu. Here's another example from Rome about the same time as the Noli plan. And what you see is that it's also a three-dimensional structure. It's not just two-dimensional. You have relationships in three dimensions of space, not just two. I mentioned earlier Charles Jenks's observations, and Charles, who has unfortunately passed away, was a friend of mine. I like Charles very much, but we had a debate going where he was arguing that the new sciences meant that we had a new exuberant form of expression, a new way of expressing our cosmology, our understanding of the world. And this to him was the most important thing about the new sciences. And that this was creating all sorts of new possibilities of new kinds of forms and new kinds of sculptural expressions and so on. And to me, my view of that is, okay, that's fair enough as a form of sculpture, but it isn't exactly the same thing as city making. City making is something very different. City making is about shaping the conditions of life, of human life and of natural life. And that's something beyond the realm of art. And for understanding this key relationship between art and life, I don't think there's anybody who formulated it better than Jane Jacobs, who in Death and Life had a chapter where she discussed this in detail. She said, we need art. Art is a very important part of cities, a very important, essential part of life, to help explain life, to show us meanings, to illuminate the relationship between the life that each of us embodies and the life outside of us, to reassure us of our own humanity. But we have to be careful because art and life are interwoven, but they're not the same things. We cannot think of the city as a giant sculpture or a sculpture garden. That is a terrible thing to do to human beings who have to live there, have to live inside of these sculptures that we've made, because the result of such a profound confusion between art and life, she says, are neither life nor art. They are taxidermy. There's something dead. There's something deadening about trying to use art to create the life of a city, instead of understanding that art and life have this mutual support of one another and need the support of one another. So for the next part of the talk, I'm gonna kind of go to a concluding section here, and I wanna focus a little more directly on urbanism. We've talked about the sciences and the importance of some of these insights for our new understanding of cities. But let's talk about what is it that we're doing when we build cities? Why do we build cities at all, right? Not just to admire the art that is there. There is a reason why we don't all live scattered across the landscape, as indeed we once did as Homo sapiens. And city making is only about 10,000 years old or so, and it's only a fraction of our human history. But of course, I think we would all recognize that we build cities in order to interact with one another, to have access to our resources, better access to our resources, to create wealth and human development, to shelter us, to protect us, to create security, defensive aspects of cities certainly, and to fundamentally connect to one another, connect to all of these things that cities give us. Again, going back to Mike Batty's and Peter Ferguson's comment about cities as places that fundamentally connect us, that are connective structures. So let's think about this idea for a moment, that when we're in an urban relationship, we not only connect to one another, we also impinge on one another's freedom. Because, for example, when you're next to me and your house is right next to me and you're partying until 2 a.m., let's say, and I want to go to sleep, you've just constrained my freedom to go to sleep. This is a problem, right? So how are we going to avoid these conflicts that are inevitable when we come together in making cities? Well, one way to do it is simply to say, okay, well, let's take your home and put it over here and take my home and put it over there. Problem solved. We're now no longer conflicting with one another. You can party until 2 a.m. and I can sleep. And this is the fundamental strategy of segregation. that is underlying a lot of our strategies of dealing with conflicts in cities. It's really the fundamental strategy of urban zoning. It's the fundamental strategy of, as you saw earlier, functional segregation, what has really been the dominant paradigm of the 20th century in many ways. And it's the idea very much behind the Athens Charter, the idea that we're going to pull the buildings apart, we're going to pull the streets up and the pedestrians apart, we're going to pull the different uses apart, we're going to rationalize and segregate the city. Well, here's another strategy that I think is a more sort of age-old strategy, and that is that we mediate between the conflicts. If you are partying until 2 a.m. and I want to go to sleep, we build some kind of a mediating structure. Maybe it's a fence between us, that our sound fence, maybe it's a soundproof glass. It's something that mediates and protects me from you and from the impacts that you're creating, whatever that might be. But we're not only separating ourselves from one another. You know, I'm not going to live in a concrete bunker, right, in order to be segregated from you. I'm going to continue to be connected to you, but I'm going to do it through the public realm, not directly. I'm not going to build a hallway right across to your house. I'm going to connect to the public realm, and I'm going to connect my house to the public realm through these intermediate semi-public and semi-private zones. And then once again, you're going to be connected to that as well, and we're going to be connected to one another as a result of that. That is a different kind of connectivity of urban structures, a connectivity that is mediating the impacts and the conflicts. And we're generating those mediations over time. We're adapting. We're saying, oh, I got to build a wall here. No, I don't want to build the wall too high. I want to drop it down when we get to the front yard and so on. And we're creating a series of rooms, room-like structures that are protecting us and giving us control, giving us the ability to interact to some degree. So a room, we can open a door, we can close a window. The same thing is true with our urban spaces. If it's a porch, it's a room that we can walk out onto and we can feel connected, and maybe we can move our chairs around, and then we can walk out into the public realm, which is also a sort of room-like space. And as a result of that, we are creating mediations between the conflicting freedoms that happen in cities, the fundamental phenomena of cities, that we create these conflicting freedoms as a result of our adjacency with one another. And we want to create mediations that are just, that allow us all to share in the city. We don't, wall anybody in, we hope. That would be unjust, right? If we created a ghetto where we forced people to live, that would be an unjust mediation. Or if we forced people perhaps to live in certain kinds of buildings, that would be unjust. There are lots of injustices going on in urban spaces today, I think we all can recognize. But what we're aiming for, and what the best cities achieve, is a kind of a working balance, not perfect, never perfect, because there's no such thing as a perfect city, but one that is approaching a just mediation between those conflicting freedoms by creating those urban rooms that I was referring to earlier. And this is something that I think is going on in all cities to one degree or another. And I think we need to recognize it, recognize that there are these connective spatial networks rooted in the scale of human beings and human experience that are these room-like structures that interconnect into what we might call a place network. So here's an example of a street around the corner from where I used to live in London, a fairly ordinary London high street. And if you look closely, what you'll notice is that there's lots of different spaces where people can be. They're sort of room-like spaces. They can be out on the street. They can be inside in the cafes, or inside in the private spaces. They can be out in the little sidewalk cafes. They can be up on the terraces or in the most private rooms. Up in their, sanctuary, so to speak. They're literal rooms, but these other spaces are room-like spaces as well. The sidewalk cafe and the room inside the cafe in the glass. And furthermore, these spaces are all interconnected with one another. They're interconnected through the ability to move, or the ability to see, or the ability to hear, or sometimes the ability to see but not hear if it's through the glass, or hear but not see if it's through the bushes, right? And this is a very complex network of connections and that exists in all cities, as I said, to one degree or another, this place network. And it's continuously self-organizing, it's continuously transforming over time. And maybe this is what urbanism is in the end, this structure of spaces, this place network, this complex network of public and private realms with room-like enclosures that we can, to one degree or another, control, and we can, to one degree or another, transform them over time and co-create the city as a result of that. So you think about the most literal rooms, right? The bedroom, the most private spaces of the home. But those also have doors that you can open or close, windows that you can open or close. You can draw the blinds. Going out to the larger spaces, the more sort of semi-public spaces, the entry room of the building, the porch out on the sidewalk, the yard, the gates that also allow you to open and close, the vegetation, et cetera. And then finally, the most public spaces, the sidewalk and the street and the squares and the plaza. All of these things are interconnected. All of them are part of this larger place network. And all of them are spaces that we can, to one degree or another, control. And we need to control, not only at the finest scale of, well, I need to close the door because I'm going to take a nap or something, or I need to remodel my house because now we've just had a baby and I need another room or whatever. And we make larger transformations over time. Maybe we totally remodel the house, or we build a new building, or we build a whole new structure of some kind. We build a new sign in front of our house, in front of our store. And this is, you can see this in the same example that I just showed. I came back 5 years later, or 7 years later, I guess it was. And you can see that there are new businesses. The old businesses have closed. They've got new signage and so on. But you can also see that these place networks have transformed, that they've now created both of these houses up above, these flats up above have created terraces out above the stores and put fences up to demarcate their urban rooms outside their terraces. And now there's a couple of plants that are demarcating a sort of entrance area going into this new business here. The sidewalk cafe has gone away for some reason. So it's not only additions, it's also subtractions sometimes, and transformations over time. So this is a transformation over 7 years or so. Here's a transformation over about a century. This is in Venice. This is a famous study by Muratori, where he shows how the cadastral plan of a section of Venice looks quite boring and simple on the left, and the same section on the right is far more articulated and transformed, and many more room-like spaces, many more of these sort of place networks that have formed and that have created this beautiful structure that we all know and love today. And this is what has created the beauty and also the complexity and the robustness and the sophistication, really, of great cities like Venice all around the world. So we need to understand how these transformations happen over time. They don't happen as one static planning action by an authority. There are many small incremental changes. They often go to the Doge and say, may I have permission to add this or do that? They're following rules, they're following processes, they're following incentives and economic forces. Shops are opening and closing and all these other things are going on and transforming over time. And that is creating the complexity and the robustness, really, of the city over time. You can see this in informal settlements, for example, at their best. They can be quite sophisticated. You can see new streets and new passageways forming as a result of, and this is the study by Ben Hamouche, where he showed how the owners will subdivide the properties, and then the new owners will come along and agree to create passageways in order to create opportunities for marketing and commerce and so on. And this gradually goes on over time and builds up the sophistication and the self-organization of the city, much like the self-organization of a biological system. And you can end up with a sort of spontaneously created high street, as this example from Mexico up at the top of the page, where you end up with a kind of main street with commerce on it and very complex self-organization. And you can see, for example, this is in Medellin, Colombia, where these informal settlements are transforming over time, sometimes with the citizens themselves coming in and making tactical urbanism or urban acupuncture, as the mayor of Medellin referred to it when I was interviewing him. They were talking about how the community voted to build this escalator on the left, quite a remarkable insertion of a infrastructure in order to avoid the unsanitary and dangerous conditions of this informal passageway, and to create a kind of series of public spaces adjoining that then triggered lots of other things going on around it, a lot of vegetation, a lot of public art, a lot of other things that were catalyzed by those changes, a little store here that opened up right next to the escalator, and so on. So again, catalysts can be quite influential in creating these space networks. And once you look at cities in this way, I think you begin to see how important this is, how universal this is. This is an example from Pisa, Italy, where you once again can begin to see these room-like spaces and the interconnections between them, the spatial connections and the structural connections between them. In this case, this is down the street from where I used to live in Portland, Oregon. These are single-family houses that have become businesses, and they've created connections between them and created new connections between the different spaces, new little balconies and of course stairwells and other things that are creating this fabric of interconnectivity that creates a very attractive environment. This is some of the most popular shopping areas in Portland, for example. And also you can see a very unhappy trend. For example, if you think about Italy in 1922, for example, and Italy in 2022, this is new buildings that were built in response to the L'Aquila earthquake. And what you can see is there's no tissue of public and private between the most private space, the home there on the right, and the most public space on the left. It is bang on to the public space without any of that kind of tissue. There's a balcony up above, which is helpful, but there isn't any of that other tissue between. And here's Oslo in 1922. There's this tissue of the street with many different kinds of spaces and places of people moving around, the sidewalk ballet, as Jane Jacobs referred to it, lots of different kinds of spaces articulated in front of the shop behind, and a little sidewalk seating area behind, and all these different structures all up and down the street. Versus this is Oslo in 2022, and this is of course not an attractive public realm, not really, I don't think you could even say it's walkable. You'd feel sorry for this poor person who has to walk through this environment. And yet this is the kind of structure that we're building today, this sort of corporate, it checks off all the boxes. It's got all the logos, it's got all the sponsors, it's got all the businesses that are, generating wealth, but it's not creating a public realm, and it's not certainly not creating a walkable pedestrian experience. So again, I think we need to recognize the genius in these kinds of environments, not because we want to, imitate them in some sort of superficial way, but because we want to understand their genetic processes. We need to understand the operating system that generated places like that, the laws, the regulations, the codes, standards, models, incentives, disincentives, all these sort of generative rules that produce the environments that we live in, for better or for worse, and particularly what we have today that is unsatisfactory and unsustainable. And that we need to recognize that public space and the adjoining private spaces and the tissue of connections between them is a very important topic for us to understand, a very important topic in the New Urban Agenda, as I said, and we'll talk about it in more detail. but it is also a way of understanding a lot of other interconnected issues of urban structure and urban life. If we talk about the spatial structure of public spaces, the spatial structure of space networks, and of the urban connectome, as I referred to it before. And next week, we're going to talk more about Jane Jacobs' work, among others. And her topic, when she talks about cities as sort of co-created places, cities that are work for everyone because they're created by everyone, as she said at one point, and thinking about how this works as a kind of economic gardening, if you will, or a process that's more like gardening than it is like carpentry. That is really the nature of cities, the kind of problem a city is. Carpentry is where you are creating a very clearly defined structure. You're cutting, you're slicing, you're creating something exactly to specifications. Gardening is different. Gardening is where you, of course, are finding and building fertile soil. You're planting good genetic seeds. You're watering and fertilizing. You're pruning and weeding, and you're building trellises and so on in order to support that growth. But it's the growth that you're supporting that you don't control that. You're allowing it to happen. You're allowing it to be incentivized. You're building the soil. You're diagnosing and improving the urban conditions. You're creating patterns and prototypes, or using patterns and prototypes. You're creating incentives. You're generating funding. You're generating regulations that control things that are undesirable, that you don't want to see happen. And you're creating the infrastructure and the frameworks that will support all of that. The planter boxes, so to speak, of a garden, or the vine supports the supports that the beanstalks will grow up on, and so on. These are the urban infrastructures, and all of these things are combined together in strategic toolkits. And this is where we need to go as urban planners and as urban designers and developers and policymakers, thinking about cities as essentially evolving structures that we can influence, but not in the way that we would influence carpentry, that we would cut to specifications, more like we are generating the results that we want to achieve, not unlike what happens in healthcare, for example, where we're generating the health of the patient and supporting the patient's health. Maybe we're doing some surgery and some other specific interventions, but overall, we're supporting the patient's own ability to heal and to grow. And we need a growing body of shareable tools and strategies. We need the regulations, the incentives, the targeted grants and micro grants, the public education processes, the changes to professional education, the catalytic projects, as I was referring to earlier, and different kinds of governance structures, improvement districts, for example, that will allow us to create these kinds of improvements, and so on. So we'll talk about that a little more next week when we talk about Jacobs' work and her remarkable book, Death and Life of Great American Cities. But this is a good point, I think, to stop and to reflect on where we are and where you are thinking about in terms of your own research, and how maybe this could be relevant for your research. Before we go into the discussion, just a housekeeping point, which is that, as you know, there's a writing assignment once a week, and it's quite simple. All I need you to do is write a 1 to 2 page summary of what you've taken away from the lectures. You can just summarize the lectures if you were describing the sort of key points to someone else who hadn't been participating in the lectures, for example, and emphasize what you think is most important in the lectures and in the reading, and how you see it relating to your work and what you think is particularly important. And it might relate to what you're discussing, and as we're having our discussions, and we've had over the last couple of days. So you might think about what particular topics you've emphasized, and particular topics from your own research that you'd like to write about. You don't need to make it super complicated, super polished document. Just try to make it readable and coherent, and so that I can understand that you're taking away some important points and that you're finding it useful for your own research. It can also help me to make suggestions for you as you're developing your own research. So we have maybe another 20 minutes or so to discuss where we've gotten to. We've spent the last 3 sessions talking about the new urban agenda, what's in it, and what are some of the sort of deeper themes behind it. Next week, we'll dive down a little more into some of the specific figures who have been particularly influential, Jane Jacobs, Christopher Alexander, and others, for a variety of reasons. And also they'll help us to illuminate some of these topics further, the understanding of the developments in the sciences and how they apply to cities. Anna, did you have a chance to look at the video? Oh, no, you haven't, because I just sent it to you, didn't I? The video from yesterday. But tell me what you're thinking about, and because you're focusing a little more at the scale of building. I did get a little bit into, as you saw, some of these ideas as they apply to the building scale, the idea of spatial networks. And, on Wednesday, we were talking about the fact that one of the benefits of the 20th century influence on design was to allow buildings to become a little more fluid and a little more open in their network structure. Is that something you're finding interesting as we're discussing this?
Yes, of course. And I'm thinking, because in my work, I also try to seek for a pattern. A pattern, I mean, maybe some kind of visible influence that is creating the floor plan, the architecture itself. And to me, I think that to see how the structures are designed, how they're followed by somehow a pattern, is quite interesting. And this is the path that I have never ever explored during my research. I just tend to analyze plans, architecture, more viewing this as an object that I admire. And because I've mentioned that the book that I've read, The Theory of the Architecture, it was at the very beginning of my research. It showed me that you can analyze the form, the floor plan, in so many different ways. And actually, what really helped me, before we had visiting Professor Jonathan Spodek, and the scope of the lectures were thermal images, something that is not really connected to my research that much. But he gave me this advice to draw, not to copy and print and just look at the images, but to draw as much as I can, to redraw floor plans, redraw elevations. And it really, really helped me, because when I draw, I see the pattern. I can see what's going on in the building. Rather, as an architect, I used to draw a lot. Now, as a scientist, I kind of quit, and now I see how much power it holds. So when you show that, but when you I tried to switch and be the best scientist that I can be for now, but at one point I think I forgot that I'm an architect in the first place. And but seeing all those different perspectives are really eye-opening, and I hope that they will be beneficial for my architectural too, in my further practice. And what I would like to ask you about is that maybe it's a very simple way of thinking, but the city reflects the needs of the people that are living there, right? In a way that it is formed. The form follows what is supposed to, or rather, the function that is expected there. You showed us how the building has changed due to the function that it was there, right? And but for me, what I see and what I don't necessarily like in the topic of architecture and urban planning, that any kind of unification maybe strips out the identity And any form of, well, how shall I put it? That when you try to look for a very, or rather a pattern that fits all, you kind of lose the identity. As myself, I see that when I was younger, I was thinking about living in Warsaw. Now, what I value is my family, and I live in Łódź. But the next years, we are planning to move to some different locations. So I'd rather adjust or move myself than adjust the city. And the dynamic between the people that are in the city and the city itself is something that I find interesting, because when on the topic of the house, we in Poland have this problem that a lot of people are choosing to build a house from the catalog, which is for me mind-blowing in a bad way, because they are trying to adapt themselves to the architecture, not otherwise. And when they have a private lot, they have all rights to do otherwise. And on the psychological sense, it really it is well, I think about it a lot. Like what has changed that we are as people, we are starting to think that we have to adjust to the architecture rather than to maybe make it as we want it, as we feel good in it. So this is something that I would like to hear your opinion on, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I would strongly encourage you to keep drawing and use drawing as a continuous way of exploring the world, because I think this is not just for designers, but for everybody. I've got a whiteboard sitting there that I doodle on all the time. I've got books, composition books that I draw in all the time. And I think it's an important way of exploring the structure of anything, especially when you're talking about space and form, right? And the ability to explore that and flesh that out and evolve that, as a designer. And so, because this idea of evolution, I think is important when you're, as a designer, working through your own design process. And then it's important beyond that at the level of the city, because it's not just, you ask the question, or you raise the point about does the city respond to people's needs? And I think it's an interactive process, because as the city responds to people's needs, the people get new needs. If you it's a evolutionary co-creative process that the city transforms over time, and we develop new needs and new problems, obviously, that need to be solved, but also new opportunities and new ways of expressing ourselves. And that's the other key point that I think you alluded to, is the differentiation that goes on. Yeah. That's so essential, that if we're too stuck in the universals, or in the models, or in the types, or you go back to Plato and Plato's forms. Plato had this idea of there's sort of pure forms out there somewhere, and we were just using instances of them. Aristotle had a very different view of that structure, and I think it's, in many ways, we today are closer to Aristotle's view, and we can talk about that later. We might touch on that, Aristotle's view of what he called hylomorphism, the relationship between form and matter, or substance and matter. The point that you might start out with a universal, but you want to evolve that universal. I want to just illustrate something from a book that you might have come across. This is called How Buildings Learn. And what's remarkable about the book is he talks about how buildings actually evolve over time to adapt to the user's abilities. And this is by Stuart Brand, who is a very interesting person, who influenced by Christopher Alexander, by the way, as well. But what you see on the cover here, by the way, these are two identical buildings in New Orleans in 1857. And these are the same two buildings today. They look totally different, right? One of them has a whole new floor added to it. They both have very different terraces. The frontages are totally different, et cetera, et cetera. These buildings have evolved, and in Stuart Brand's words, they've learned. They've actually transformed over time. And the other key point that he makes in the book is that not only do buildings learn in this way, but they do so at different scales. This idea that there is what he refers to and has been referred to previously as pace layering, that you have different components of the building. And this is also referred to as shearing layers, different components of the building that are changing at different rates. Obviously, you have the furnishings of the building that are changing quite frequently. Then you have maybe the walls and the paint colors, the paint that's on the wall that changes a little less frequently. And then you have the walls themselves that maybe get moved around and changed, and doors get added, windows get added, whatever. And then you have the basic structure of the building that changes even more slowly. And then the exterior skin that changes fairly slowly as well, but might change, as you saw in the New Orleans example. And then finally, you have the ground itself, the slowest to change, literally the sort of tectonic change that goes on in the physical realm. So I think what I take away from that is the idea that our buildings and our environments need to be malleable. They need to be able to be adapted to our changing needs, and that our needs can change in response. It's an algorithm. It's a cyclical process that goes on all the time at different scales. And that's the marvel of it. It's so complex that we can't really ever totally control it. And the idea of controlling it in the simple version of that idea that maybe we once had as a naive idea as architects is not really the right idea. The right idea is, again, going back to this idea of gardening, that we're allowing these things to grow and to change and to flourish and to sometimes conflict and sometimes create problems that we then go out and deal with. We pull the weeds or whatever. This is really, I think, a more sophisticated way of thinking about design as a process. And there's one other point I'll just make in response to your great points, Anna, is the idea that when you're doing architecture, it is a science. It is, I don't think you should think of the science on the one hand and the design on the other. They are also in an iterative process. And I mentioned Aristotle, and he talked a lot about city building as sort of the highest, or architecture as one of the highest forms of scientific knowledge, because you have to pull all this other stuff together and you have to apply it to the problems that you're dealing with. The idea that there are actually discoveries that are made through the process of architecture that are scientific discoveries. If you talk about, Pythagoras and the Pythagorean theorem and other things that have had a long history with the building arts and the design arts, and engineering and the relationship to mathematics and so on. So I wouldn't segregate your thinking too much into the science and the design, because often they're also an iterative process between those two things.
Yeah, there is a science between the design. That is that the point, right? So yes, but just in short, just what breaks my heart for now is that people agree so much on living in interiors that are full of IKEA stuff, and I think that maybe there are that is not certainly what they like, but that what they are trained to like. I don't know. This is something very sad for me, in fact, because I remember when I was a child, I used to visit my friends and every house was different. And for me, as a quite sensitive person, it was very interesting to see all of this different stuff that they have collected, that maybe they were handmade or so. They were talking something to me about the owner, and now I cannot see any identity. It's just another IKEA interior with full of stuff that maybe are not supposed to be there for any other reason than decoration.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think I understand exactly what you're saying about being discouraged about the sort of standardization and homogenization and globalization even of many of our processes today. I think you know, one of the points that I made, and I've given you some readings from Design for a Living Planet, this book, and one of the points there is that we've become very, very good at economies of scale and economies of standardization. But those are not the only two economies that exist in nature. They do exist in nature. You know, DNA uses the same 4 molecules. It's a very economical structure in that sense. DNA makes billions of seeds, you know, so there's economies of scale, and the seeds all have the same genetic components, economies of structure, of standardization. But there's also economies of place, what's adjacent to other things that it's adjacent to. That's very, very important in biological systems. And also economies of differentiation. The fact that as you become evolve over time, you become differentiated. And those are very powerful economies as well. Not only, you know, economies in the financial sense, but economies in the biological sense of creating wealth, creating wellness. Those words are related: wholeness, wellness, wealth, health, etc. And those are things that we can see in biological systems. So what I take away from all of these topics, and what I find so hopeful, frankly, is that we do have a kind of lens that we can use in the sciences to look at our condition, where we are right now. And for example, you'll see when you review yesterday's lecture, I talked a little bit about behavioral economics and the reasons that we often make the choices that we do, because we're sort of trapped in a certain set of predefined choices, the choice architecture, as it's referred to. If the only choice you have is, you know, 27 different versions of the same house, and all you get to do is, you know, go to IKEA and pick out this style or that style or that style, then that's the choice that's predefined for you. And someone else has made the choice of that model, that economic model that is, again, creating economies of standardization and economies of scale, but it's not embraced the economies of differentiation and given you the power as a homeowner or tenant to say, I want to change this environment. I want to choose another environment. I want to live in a different place, in a different way, in a different, you know, degree of privacy or whatever. And this is what makes cities wonderful, ultimately, is the diversity. And this goes back to what Jane Jacobs talked about. And if we lose that diversity, we're losing something that's really at the core of what cities are, what great cities are. So I would encourage you to have hope that, at least, first of all, understand the nature of our problems. And because I find that, first of all, fascinating, and second of all, inspiring, because it shows that these are problems that can be dealt with, and maybe it shows some of the ways that they can be dealt with. It shows some of the ways forward for us in our various predicaments that we have in our time. Dominic, do you have any comments? We've got a couple more minutes left, not too much longer.
Yes, during your lecture today, you made a lot of references to mathematics and other sciences, for which I thank you very much. As a mathematics graduate, I'm very fond of such things. You also mentioned the so-called cellular automata and the possibility of describing urban growth using this model. Generally speaking, cellular automata are part of a broader mathematical and computer theory, which I have been interested in for several years. And to be honest, I'm familiar with many types of automaton, but I had never heard about of something like a cellular automata before. I will certainly read up on it in my free time. And perhaps this kind of automation could find application in other topics as well, also in management. In the same context, I see some connections between this area of mathematics as well as theoretical computer science, which I am interested in because it is also based on mathematics. And another issue that you mentioned, but in the first lecture, you mentioned your article wiki as a pattern language, and I associate the term pattern language with script languages and parallel algorithms that occur in the theory of mathematics and theoretical computer science. I have not yet read your article on the wiki, but it seems to me that, again, there is a great similarity and commonality of issues here for different scientific disciplines. Furthermore, you also mentioned possible connections and spaces in urban planning, certain connections of places where people can stay and generally be. I think perhaps here would also be a good application for the mathematical theory of graphs, which just makes it possible to study the grid of connections between different spaces from a mathematical point of view as well. So thus I see how many of the topics I learned about during my mathematics as well as management studies occur in architecture and urban planning, and how applicable those topics and issues are here.
Yeah, well, you can certainly see more about that with Mike Batty's work, talking about a science of cities. My friend Nikos Salingaros, the mathematician at the University of Texas, who's written a lot about algorithmic processes. This I'm showing right now, a cellular automaton that is and there's a number of these that you can find on the web, by the way, that generates these very lifelike patterns, quite interesting. This is called a Gosper's glider gun, and it's just a simple set of equations, generative algorithms that are generating these white and black dots on the screen according to simple rules, and the rules are based on what is in the adjacent square, right? So it's the result of this sort of interactive pattern is actually generating form, and generating a pretty remarkable form. And you can play with this, and it's really fun to see how these different structures can evolve. And you can actually, this is a static one, but there's others that you can go to, and they're interactive, and you can actually write your own little formula and see how it plays out. Sometimes nothing happens, sometimes something amazing will happen. So it's a fascinating area, and it certainly does have a lot of direct relevance to how markets can behave, how you can end up with certain kinds of phenomena in markets and in economic processes. You can have contagion, you can have certain behavioral activities, certain behavioral influences that cause things to take off in interesting and sometimes not very helpful ways. But also you can have creativity, and you can have people generating wealth of various kinds, not only financial wealth, but wealth of well-being, and wealth of a beautiful environment, beautiful life, and really, and livability in an urban environment. So there's all fascinating topics, and we'll dive into them in more detail next week. Please do get your paper to me by the end of the day, Sunday. And then there's another short reading assignment for our next lecture, which will be on Monday, right? I'm just remembering my own schedule here. I think next week we're going to do Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So please get those assignments to me, and I will email you back the link to all three of these videos, this one as well as yesterday and the day before, if you'd like to review any of those. And I will see you all on Monday. Have a good weekend.
Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah.